Right, in this lesson, let's look at the next topic, part one topic of old buildings. Now, buildings is always a popular topic, right? Whether it's a public building, a home, a hotel, a cafe, a museum. Here, the focus is on old buildings. Again, I think in society, this is becoming a modern and popular topic because a lot of old buildings are being destroyed in the name of progress, meaning to make way for new modern buildings, intelligent buildings, they call them. So when it comes to old buildings, there are two types, right? There's the type that is looked after and maintained well. So these often have a high cultural value or heritage value, such things as monuments or museums, even old factories. Where I live in Manchester, sorry, I don't live in Manchester, I'm forgetting. Where I come from in Manchester, it was the centre of the Industrial Revolution, right? And there are some old factories that go back 200 years and they are protected and looked after by the government, right? Listed buildings, they're called. So this is one type. The other type of old building is the one that is not looked after, that is left to fall apart. And these can be often very dangerous buildings because they're not in a good condition. Okay, let's have a look at some vocabulary talk that we can use here on this topic. So I mentioned a listed building, right? This is very much in the UK. A listed building means it's protected by the government. So it's on a list of protected buildings, usually because they have a historical value or a cultural value or a heritage value. Heritage, an important word, meaning basically the culture and the tradition, like cultural value. Okay. Other words we've got in disrepair. So if you look at it, dis means negative or not, repair. So something that's not repaired is something in bad condition. You can say this house is in disrepair. My old phone is in disrepair. And even stronger, in ruins. A ruin is something that is almost destroyed. So when we say a building is in ruins, it means it's in very bad condition. A bit like this one. Okay, great. Let's have a look at some of the questions you may get on the topic of old buildings. Have you ever seen old buildings in a city? Should we preserve old buildings in cities? Do you prefer to live in an old building or a modern one? Are there any old buildings you want to visit in the future? Great. So let's choose a question. I'm going to ask you. As always, you give me your answer, right? On the spot, improvised. Don't prepare. Here we go. Have you ever seen old buildings in a city? Okay, thank you. And here is something I might say. Yes, I have. There are some old historic buildings in my city, actually, which are listed buildings, and they're protected by the government. As well, there is also a handful of derelict buildings, which, to be honest, are really falling apart and nearly in ruins. Okay, let's have a look at some of the language I've used there. Okay, so I began saying, yes, I have, direct answer. And I've talked about different kinds of buildings, right? Historic buildings. Sometimes you can say historical buildings. In this context, actually, both of those are okay. I've talked about listed buildings and later derelict buildings. Derelict meaning in very, very bad condition, not looked after, right? So listed buildings, and I repeat or just make it clear, listed buildings and protected by the government. I'm kind of repeating myself, but that's okay. We very often in spoken English say the same thing twice in a slightly different way to make sure our communication is stronger. It is possible that listed buildings, that some examiners may not know that, especially if they're not British, but you are showing your knowledge of British English and you're making it clear what the meaning is. So it's often a good idea to say the same thing twice in a slightly different way. As well, right, in addition, on top of that, very often as well goes at the end of the sentence, but in spoken English you can put it at the beginning, right? As well, there is a handful of derelict buildings. A handful, instead of saying a lot of or several, a handful literally is maybe 4 or 5 to fill a hand, 5 fingers. A handful of derelict buildings, which, to be honest, is a nice kind of linking word, to be honest, are falling apart, nearly in ruins. Falling apart is literally falling to pieces, right? Falling down. In ruins, we mentioned like the Colosseum in Rome. It's so old, it's almost destroyed. It's in ruins. Some nice language. Let's move on and look at another question. Right, here's another question. Again, without thinking too much. Well, you have to think, but without preparing too much. Give me your answer straight away, okay? Should we preserve old buildings in cities? Okay, thank you. Great. Now, you can come back and compare. This is what I might say. Well, it depends really. If they have heritage or cultural value, then yes. On the other hand, if they're in disrepair and potentially dangerous, then it would be better to knock them down, I think. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the language I was using there. So I began with this discourse marker. It depends, really. And then, on the other hand, so I've given it depends. There's this, and on the other hand, there's that. Okay. Very simple structure to use. If they have heritage or cultural value, so heritage value is really the same as cultural value. That your heritage is the culture, the tradition of a society, right? You may have heard of UNESCO, is a international heritage organization that has different heritage sites that are recognized as being having strong cultural value for society and the world. So then yes, on the other hand, if they are in disrepair, we looked at dis, negative, repair, so not repaired, bad condition, in disrepair, and potentially dangerous, right? Then it would be better. So if they are blank, it would be better to do this. It's a nice structure. If they are ba ba ba, it would be better to ba ba ba. It's a conditional where I'm giving a recommendation, right? Knock them down. So to knock something down actually has 2 meanings. It can be where a car hits a person or a thing and knocks a person down. But here it's about destroying a building. You know, where they have that big ball that knocks down the building, to knock them down. Lovely. Good. You can go back and have a listen, practice some of the language, and try and answer the questions again. That's it for old buildings.